I've got to start this in a slightly odd way, and I didn't think I would say this on the radio, but could you start off by explaining the point that you're making in the book by talking about Jacob's masturbation machine?
Sure. So Jacob was a patient of mine. He is a scientist, and he came to see me because of a very debilitating sex addiction that started out with compulsive masturbation to pornography, but eventually progressed to him inventing his own masturbation machine. And this was a machine that eventually his wife found out about, and of course, it was a source of a lot of shame for him. He would regularly dismantle it and throw it away, and then find himself going back into the garbage to get it out again. But it was just, for me, a very vivid example of the dovetailing between technology, technological innovation, and our increasing vulnerability to addiction in the modern age.
He said, I connect a metal rod to a record player. The other end I connect to an open metal coil, which I wrap it with a soft cloth. I put the cloth and coil around my penis. You say in the book I had an urge to laugh.
Well, I mean, yes, I did at the same time that I wanted to cry. Oftentimes, laughter is a defense against sadness or fear. So, and I do explain in that moment that for me, it was a defense against those things. I wanted to laugh or cry or both at the same time. It seemed so incredibly tragic.
That someone could be so compelled to seek that pleasure that they would create a machine and be addicted to that act.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize that, he's a wonderful man. He's kind and thoughtful and generous and bright. So he's a very likable, wonderful person, but he really got caught up in this terrible, terrible addiction.
So let's go to what it is causes the addiction, whether it's the thing itself or the response to the thing. And involved in that is dopamine. What is dopamine? What does it do?
Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical in the brain that is intimately associated with our experience of motivation, pleasure, and reward. It's also very involved in movement. So people who develop Parkinson's disease are people who stop making enough dopamine in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And it's not an accident that dopamine is involved in both pleasure, motivation, and motion, because it's important to move toward the object of our desire in order to get it. Dopamine is also intimately associated in the process of becoming addicted. And what essentially happens as we become addicted is that as our brains are repeatedly flooded by these highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors that release a whole lot of dopamine in the reward pathway, the way that our brain compensates is by down-regulating our own dopamine production and dopamine transmission, but not just back down to tonic baseline levels. Our brain actually goes below baseline levels before returning to baseline tonic dopamine levels. So the key there is that for every pleasure, there's a cost, and that cost is pain. And that pain is often experienced as the hangover or the come down, but there are also more subtle manifestations of that, just that moment of wanting a second piece of chocolate, to play one more video game, to watch one more episode of our favorite Netflix series. And importantly, as we continue to bombard our brain's reward pathway with these repeated high-potency pleasure drugs and behaviors, essentially we overload the system, and we become unable to compensate or re-regulate, and we get stuck in a dopamine deficit state, which is essentially akin to a clinical depression, where we experience no pleasure at all in other things in our life. The only time we feel normal is when we're doing our drug. And when we don't have access to our drug, we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and craving, intrusive thoughts of wanting to use.
So I've seen you describe it as like a seesaw. the dopamine means that the level goes down, and so it's got to come down on either side to equal out. How quickly does that happen? So if I do a thing that brings me joy, and the thing I think about when I think, am I addicted to something, is probably at the moment is a game called Football Manager. I just can't. I can't. I'll be honest with you, Doc, I can't put it down. I mean, I'm taking Plymouth Argyle to newfound heights, but I can't put it down. So when I play my Football Manager game and involve myself in this deeply immersive experience of apparently being a football manager, how quickly does the pain come in?
So this is, from a neuroscientist's perspective, a point of debate. Some neuroscientists argue that this homeostatic down-regulating or re-regulating mechanism kicks in immediately. Others think that it requires iterative repetitions over time to have an appreciable effect. But I would say experientially, if we're really paying attention, we can notice it happening essentially immediately. And I would posit to you to think about the next time you are engaged in playing Football Manager, how you feel in the moment, which I imagine is transported, not thinking about yourself, not thinking about where you are, in a kind of a different or altered fantasy land, which is very, very pleasurable, right? Because we all like to escape our own thoughts and problems and ruminations, right? Okay, well, we can get to that, the winning versus the losing, because there's a key point there. But then for you to pay attention to that moment when you have to get off, when finally whatever, the desire to continue to play is overcome by your rational need to get off, and then how you feel in the immediate aftermath, because most of us will feel a kind of a falling away, a come down, a restlessness, even an intense kind of existential anxiety of falling into the abyss. And I would argue this is our dopamine plummeting below baseline levels.
Is there a way that you could keep the dopamine so high that you don't ever need to do the come down? Or will you just eventually physiologically, if not neurologically, crash?
So now you're talking like someone with addiction, because that is essentially what people with addiction try to do. As soon as their pleasure-pain balance tips to the side of balance, to balance out or counterbalance the surge of dopamine, they say to themselves, well, now, wait a minute, I'm not going to tolerate that. I'm going to do that again, and I'm going to do more. And if that starts not to work, I'm going to get a more potent form, or I'm going to mix that with another drug, or I'm going to try another drug altogether. And it's that constant battle to repeat or replenish or revisit that original positive experience that drives the person with addiction to seek out that substance again and again and again, till ultimately the brain really comes to mistake that substance as necessary for survival.
And is there any science to suggest that the first time is the best time? So the first time you take the drug, or the first time you get Plymouth Argyle promoted, whatever it might be, that the first time the hit is so strong and the pleasure so intense that even as you try and to seek that pleasure again and again, it's always dulled. The dopamine released is not as much as it was back in the first time, and that's what you're always chasing.
So I think there's both science and experiential evidence. I've had many patients tell me that it's that first moment of drinking or smoking or whatever it was, they knew they were both in trouble and had found the life solution for them, and that the rest of their lives was just in pursuit of recreating that moment. But we also have plenty of scientific evidence that shows that with repetition, we need more to get the same effect. We can probably recreate that initial feeling at first, but we need more to do it, especially with repeated exposures over time. And eventually, no matter how much you get or how potent it is, it essentially stops working. And that's that pleasure-pain balance where we get to a point where the balance is tipped to the side of pain, and now we need to just keep using in order to level the balance. We don't get any more pleasure out of it.
What can we say then about the things that are addictive? So when we think, you think of people who have addictions, the normal one is a drug, isn't it? It's cigarettes or tobacco or alcohol or heroin, whatever. What is it actually that is addictive? Well, intoxicants are
reinforcing in large part because they mimic a chemical that our brain or body already makes. And it's something, whether it's an opioid or a cannabinoid or a stimulant, our body makes those chemicals, and we need those chemicals to survive. But typically, in order to generate our body to make those chemicals, we have to put ourselves in either extremely stressful situations that kicks off our own endogenous sort of healing response to keep us alive, or we have to work very, very hard to get those chemicals to be released.
Is that serotonin? Well, is one of those serotonin?
It's dopamine. So
right.
Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's opioids. We make our own opioids in many different forms. It's serotonin. It's norepinephrine. It's endocannabinoids. We make our own cannabis.
No,
we do. And it binds to our very own anandamide receptors, and anandamide is Sanskrit for bliss. So we make all of these things. And what happens is that nature, in its multifaceted, mysterious way, makes these chemicals too, in mimic of the ones that we make. And when we ingest these chemicals into our bodies, we have an immediate and reinforcing, a positive, in general, positive response to that. But also importantly, we tell our bodies, hey, I got a whole lot of this from an external source, so you can turn off. You don't need to make this anymore. And that's essentially the vicious cycle.
If it's a seesaw, the dopamine and then the low level as a result of having gone very high, that you can't get back into homeostasis or equilibrium, can pain be addictive?
So first of all, pain is actually a really nice source of more enduring dopamine because but wait. There's a footnote here. So why is that? Because the way that our body responds to a painful stimulus is to upregulate dopamine, norepinephrine, opioids, serotonin to compensate for that painful stimulus. So in other words, instead of getting our dopamine directly from the stimulus, we get our dopamine indirectly through our body's own re-regulating homeostatic healing mechanisms. Having said that, it is still possible to get addicted to pain, and we see this in many forms. I have patients who are addicted to exercise. I have patients who cut on themselves. By the way, cutting releases a huge amount of endorphins, which is our own endogenous opioids, which then releases dopamine. Typically, the types of stimuli, painful stimuli that become addictive are the ones that are either too painful all of a sudden or just too much pain quantity-wise over too long a period of time. So when you think about what makes something addictive, the four key features are access, quantity, potency, and novelty. And when any of those two things has the volume turned too high, then a substance or a behavior can become addictive.
Dr. Anna Lembke is with us, Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Her book is called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And what strikes me, Professor, from having, I'll be honest, I haven't read all of the book, but I've read most of the book and I've listened to various interviews that you've given, is the challenge of the notion that addiction has been thought about as a mindset, as opposed to the reality and the science, your own science of it, that shows that it's not a mindset, it's a disease.
That's right. I mean, I think I would go even further and say that for hundreds of years, addiction has been thought of as a moral problem, a willpower problem, a spirituality problem, when in fact, yes, it's a disease. And it's a disease in a couple of different ways. First of all, just like with other diseases, there are some people who are innately more vulnerable to the problem of addiction than others. And about 50 to 60% of the risk of getting addicted is inherited, meaning that if you have yes, which is one of the most heritable mental illnesses that we have, according to, the latest data. So if you have a biological parent or grandparent with addiction, you are more likely than the average person to become addicted, even if raised outside of that substance-using home. So that's a really powerful genetic component. But then beyond that innate, inborn vulnerability, we do know that addictive use over long periods of time permanently changes the brain. That doesn't mean that recovery doesn't happen. people can get into the recovery. They do get into long-lasting recovery. In fact, I hold up people in recovery as modern-day prophets for the rest of us because they're very, very wise because of it. But it's also very true that you've probably permanently altered your brain once you become severely addicted. And we know that from animal studies, but also from human experience, that people with addiction, even after years of abstaining from their drug of choice, if they use their drug again, will immediately be plummeted right back into the worst of their addiction. Animal studies show the same. If you take a rat and you inject it every day with cocaine, it will start to run frantically in a cage, and by the day 7, it will be just ripping across that cage compared to the first day when it would be hanging out on the sidelines. If you then don't inject that rat with cocaine for a whole year, which is a rat lifetime, and then after a year has gone by, re-inject that rat with cocaine, it will immediately be running as if it were on day 7 again, suggesting that there's some latent echo that never goes away.
I do that the idea of addiction being genetic.
Oh yeah, this is a
hard one if you've always believed people with addiction to be able to, you've always said to people with addiction, oh, come on, you can snap yourself out of it, you can, da-da-da-da-da. If it's in your genes.
Oh yeah, no, it's really a humbling disease, I'll tell you, because it can happen to anybody. You can have the best parents and the best childhood, more money, the best spouse, great kids, a great job, and you can fall prey to addiction and get really caught up in that vortex. And I've seen it happen many times. Addiction crosses all of those lines, and it's because it's really what we call a stress vulnerability diathesis. It's that combination between innate vulnerability and then the environment. And in modern day times, the environment is risky because drugs are everywhere and everything's become drugified.
It's not just drugs, substances that can be that are obviously people can become addicted to. Is it true that there are apps, social media, whatever, that are set up, designed to kick the dopamine levels up based on how it looks, how it feels, how it sounds, to make people addicted?
I mean, I would argue that all apps are made to be addictive. That's the capitalist mandate. I mean, these are products that are engineered to be, consumed at the highest possible rate.
But engineered based on the science around dopamine.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
So these apps or these interfaces are made by people who have intentionally studied motivation and what keeps people engaged. And they've figured it out. I mean, we've cracked the code on motivation and reward. But I would argue that to vilify apps alone is to, paint an enemy in a way that's not really recognizing all the other potential enemies. For example, in the book, I talk about my addiction to romance novels, and I would argue that romance novels have become more potent and more addictive. People know how to write them now on formula so that every time you end a chapter, it ends on a cliffhanger and you have to keep going. I would say that the invention of the e-reader makes them all that much more accessible, which makes them more addictive. Movies are more addictive. They're more graphic. They're more potent. We all know that, Netflix series, they always end one episode in a way that you can't but say, next episode. It's only the strong person who can, not click on next episode. And the same thing with social media apps, the bottomless bowls, the flashing lights, the enumeration. So giving things a number makes them more addictive. Why? Because we're innately hierarchical. We want to compare ourselves to others and put ourselves in order in that hierarchy. Rankings in video games. The ways in which these apps also follow us, learn what we know, and then prompt us to do something similar. That really engages dopamine because dopamine is very sensitive to novelty and new things in the environment.
My worry is that when I go and fire up the laptop to turn into Plymouth Argyle manager again on Football Manager, I'm going to worry that any form of pleasure is going to possibly become addictive and therefore see it as possibly painful or something to avoid, which sounds like quite a boring life.
Right. So, yes, this is not to say that pleasurable activities or intoxicants even are bad. That's not the message. Intoxicants have been with us since the beginning of human time.
Well, we create them ourselves. I mean, you were saying about the inner endocannabinoids.
Yeah, we create them ourselves, but the ones that we ingest externally are the ones that we really like, because with very little effort we get a big, huge response. And let me just say that, there's a place and a time, but the problem is that there are so many intoxicants now, and they're so potent, so much more potent than they used to be. And they're so much more accessible. They're really 24/7. And so we're all at much greater risk for slipping into the vortex of compulsive overconsumption than ever before. We also have more time than we ever had before. Not only do we have more days, living now on average to 80 plus years old, but we have more time on any given day. So in the United States, the average person has about 4 to 5 hours of leisure time. This is about 3 to more hours than in the 1800s, when the average person had 1 to 2 hours of leisure time on any given day. We're projected in 2040 to have up to 8 hours of leisure time in any given day. So we've created these machines that do the work for us, that make these really potent drugs that are everywhere. We have all kinds of time to use them. And it turns out that is indeed what we're doing with our time. Yeah. We are recreating to our own disadvantage. 70% of I was just going to add one thing. 70% of the world's global deaths are due to modifiable risk factors, and the top 3 are a sedentary lifestyle, smoking, and a poor diet.
Wow. So there are more opportunities to escape.
More opportunities to escape, more opportunities to get high, more potent versions of old drugs, new drugs like video games that didn't exist before.
But are we saying that whilst the drugs create the release of the chemicals that can lead to addiction, it's the chemicals being released that cause the addictions rather than the substance themselves? So
that's right.
You can so really you can be addicted to absolutely anything if it elicits that dopamine response in the brain. Although, again, you referenced it on a different place, but the idea of broccoli or celery being addictive feels like not possible.
Right, not possible. So there's a point at which that thought that anything could be addictive breaks down. On the other hand, if we hadn't eaten anything for a week, broccoli would taste pretty darn good. So it's the relativity of it. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's that these substances and behaviors, no matter what their biological mechanism, whether it's through the endocannabinoid system, the endo-opioid system, or working directly on dopamine, the final common pathway of all of them is to release a whole lot of dopamine in the reward pathway. And this is really important to the etiology or understanding of the development of addiction. What that results in is our own body down-regulating dopamine production and dopamine transmission to compensate so that we're always chasing our tail.
Chris says, Tom, could you ask if there is a link between someone who has high levels of dopamine and someone who is deemed a psychopath?
So I don't know about any data regarding high levels of dopamine in a psychopath. If you're talking about like high baseline levels, in fact, I would probably hypothesize that it would be low levels of dopamine that would be consistent with psychopathy, because it is people with sort of lower baseline levels or sort of low reward thresholds who might be more inclined to seek out stimulation in extreme ways, including through, addictive substances and behaviors, or through kind of, let's say, extreme interpersonal kinds of interactions.
And the other one from Jim here is, do you believe that religious fundamentalism is an addiction? Absolutely.
I do think that can be a form of addiction, but I would say potentially an adaptive one. If you're in a healthy religious community and you're sharing healthy values, it can, of course, be maladaptive. So, if we're kind of addicted to a community that's teaching us things that are patently untrue or encouraging behaviors that harm self and others, that's obviously not good.
So, but if I slightly mentioned this earlier, but forgot about it. So can I ask it again about the idea of being addicted to an idea? So when you say, there's rehab for substances, the real things that people are addicted to, if you are addicted to an idea, a thought, that just keeps reappearing and reappearing, and you explore it and you go down rabbit holes and you can't get out of it, and suddenly you're not paying attention to this, that and the other, you're not dealing with the things in your life. How can you rehabilitate yourself not to think about various things?
So let me just say that there it's a fine line between an obsession and an addiction, and typically the way that we would distinguish those is whether or not it's egosyntonic, and by that I mean that when people have ruminating intrusive thoughts around using a substance, it's usually egosyntonic, meaning that there is a sense of not wanting to use a substance, but there's a sense that the substance will feel good. Whereas OCD or ruminative obsessions are usually intrusive thoughts that are not necessarily a part of that person's everyday reality. That's not that important. The bottom line, it probably engages similar pathways in the brain. And in fact, the way to target obsessional thinking is not that different from the way to target an addictive substance. One of the ways to do that is to try to abstain from thinking that thought, recognizing that it's a neural circuit that you can distract yourself from by trying to cultivate other types of neural circuits. But another way is to actually just sort of mindfully meditate on that thought, especially if it's an intrusive negative thought, and just tolerate the distress and try to follow it down to its final common pathway and realize that, the ways in which it's not consistent with reality, or even if it were to come true, it wouldn't be that bad. So there are kinds of mental gymnastics that you can do.
There's a guy called David Goggins who says there's no such thing as a bad experience.
Yeah, that's a really nice sort of Zen approach.
Yeah, it is a bit. It's also complete rubbish in real life, isn't it, if we're honest?
Well, yes, right. Obviously, there are just factually speaking, horrific experiences that we would all. But I think the point, I don't know this person's work, but I think the point he's trying to make is that almost every experience is an opportunity for learning. Yeah. And so in that sense, can be spun positive.
It's run out of time. It's frustration about doing only an hour on this. I was going to ask you whether addiction can ever be subconscious.
Well, many times it is. I mean, most people aren't aware of their addiction as it's developing. It's often called denial. Yeah. One of my patients said that denial means don't even know I am lying. And so in very many ways, the addiction is like a waking dream. We're not fully awake to the behaviors until something happens that jars us out of that kind of lack of awareness.
So I think I have that partly with Twitter. So I find myself sort of, I think about, I'm not going to look at Twitter, and then mindlessly, accidentally find myself sort of endlessly scrolling through stuff and then go, oh God, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Why am I on this?
Yeah, so that's classically described as a symptom of addiction, a compulsive automaticity where you planned not to do it, then you find yourself doing it and don't even know how you got there. Very well described.
Right, I'm coming off that thing. And finally, Professor, because I'm almost addicted to asking this question, very, very quickly, is there any role for psychedelics in rewiring the brain in order to remove some of those addictive pathways?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research on this. I'm personally a psychedelic skeptic. I think it's unlikely that psychedelics are going to be the one-time miracle cure for a chronic relapsing and remitting disease. I think typically addiction recovery requires a lot of work over a long period of time and changing behaviors and learning new behaviors. However, I'm open to the idea, the possibility that in the right set and with the right mindset and the right setting, there may be some individuals who can gain a new perspective from psychedelics and then possibly be motivated to pursue the long-term changes in behavior that recovery requires.
It's been terrific to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. Dr. Anna Lembke, Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioural Sciences at Stanford University. I've had lots of you asking what her book is called. It's called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence.